The rain was falling hard on the empty field, and the wind was cold and sharp across the farmer's face as he stepped out with a flashlight in, his hand looking around his land because he had heard something strange and soft and not like any animal. He knew, and not like any machine either, and his boots sank into the wet earth as he moved forward, slowly breathing heavily and listening with all his focus. And then he saw her. She was standing near the edge of the cornfield, soaked to the bone, and her arms wrapped tightly around three small shapes who were shivering and weak and hiding behind her legs. And she looked up when she saw the light, and her eyes were not like human eyes, but full of pain and fire and hunger and pride at the same time, and her voice was low and shaking, but strong as she said the words he would never forget. "I will work your fields, human, just feed my hungry children." The farmer was shocked and silent and stared at her, trying to understand what he was seeing. Because this was not a dream and not some prank, and she was not from this world. He could see that from her pale skin and glowing eyes and the strange silver marks across her neck and arms, and the children looked even worse with thin bodies and sunken eyes and no shoes on their feet and no coats on their backs and rainwater dripping from their hair. He stepped closer slowly and held out his hand, but she flinched and stepped back, ready to fight, even though she had no weapon, and looked like she would fall if the wind blew a little harder, and the children clung to her legs tighter, and the farmer could see their tiny fingers shaking and their ribs showing through the strange cloth they wore, and he felt something deep in his chest, something that hurt like a memory. He took off his coat and put it over the children, and she watched him with sharp eyes, full of questions and fear and hope and maybe something else, and he pointed toward his house and said, "Come with me," and she did not move right away and looked behind her into the dark as if checking for something or someone, and then finally nodded and followed him without a word inside the house. The fire was warm and the smell of soup filled the air, and the farmer brought blankets and towels and set them down near the fire, and the children sat slowly and stared at everything as if it was magic, and the woman stayed standing wet and silent and watching everything like a hawk. And when the farmer handed her a bowl, she took it with both hands, but gave it to the smallest child first, and then the next, and then the last, and only then she sat down. But she did not eat. The farmer sat across from her and asked her name, but she did not answer and only said again, "I will work your fields," and then looked at her children and added, "Please feed them." And the farmer nodded and said, "They can stay," and she nodded too. But her eyes were still sharp and her body ready to move if needed. That night the rain kept falling and the wind howled outside, and the farmer could not sleep because he kept thinking about her and her children and where they came from and why they looked so broken and why no one else had seen them, and if someone was looking for them, and what kind of trouble he had brought to his door, and yet he could not find it in himself to regret it. At some point he walked to the kitchen and poured himself a cup of water and stood near the window looking outside, and he saw her standing outside in the cold again without a coat and staring into the woods, her arms crossed and her face calm but hard like stone. And he went to the door and opened it and asked her, "Why are you out here?" And she turned slowly and said quietly, "I do not sleep when I do not know if we are safe." He asked her, "Are you in danger?" And she did not answer and only said again, "I will work your fields, and tomorrow I start." And then she went back inside and sat near her children and did not say another word. And the farmer stood at the door for a long time, thinking about her words and the way she looked at the dark, and the way the children had not made a sound, and the way his quiet life had changed in just one night. He knew deep down that nothing would be the same again, and that something big was coming, something he did not understand yet, but it was already at his doorstep, and all he could do now was wait and watch and be ready. The morning sun rose slowly behind the hills, casting a soft orange light across the field that was still wet from last night's rain, and the air smelled of damp soil and cold wind. And inside the wooden farmhouse, the children were asleep, huddled together under warm blankets, while the woman stood near the window watching the land in silence, her eyes scanning the edges of the forest, as if expecting someone or something to appear from the trees. She did not rest. Her back was straight, her face still, and her fingers clenched around the edge of the curtain, as if letting go would bring danger to her and her children. And when the farmer entered the room with a quiet step, carrying a tray of bread and warm tea, she turned her head slowly and nodded once, not in thanks but in recognition that He was there, and still willing to help without asking for anything in return. He placed the tray on the table and pulled out a chair and sat down quietly, his eyes on her face, trying to read her thoughts, trying to understand the pain she carried, like a weight on her shoulders. And when he spoke, his voice was gentle, like someone speaking to a frightened animal who might run at the smallest noise. And he asked her again what her name was and where she came from and why she was running. She looked at him and said nothing for a while, and then sat down across from him, her hands resting on the table and her eyes on the tea as steam curled into the air. And finally she said, I had a name once, but I buried it, and I had a home once, but it burned, and I had a family bigger than this, but they were taken, and only these 3 remain, and I promised them they would never go hungry again, even if I had to break myself to keep that promise. The farmer listened in silence, his heart heavy with the pain in her voice, and he poured her tea and pushed the bread toward her, but she shook her head and said, they eat first, always, they eat first. And he nodded and left the tray there before standing and walking outside to begin his work for the day. But he glanced back once and saw her watching the children with a look that held the whole galaxy of sorrow and strength. By midday, she came out into the field with her sleeves rolled up and her feet bare and her arms ready to carry whatever needed to be lifted, and the farmer handed her a basket and pointed toward the vegetable rows, and she began to work. Without a word, without a break, without any sign of weakness, and the soil clung to her skin and the sun burned her back. But she moved like she had done this all her life, or maybe like she had done much worse. The children sat on the porch watching their mother and watching the farmer, and then one of them, the smallest, picked up a small wooden stick and began to draw in the dirt, and soon the others joined him, making shapes and symbols that the farmer could not understand. But they smiled for the first time, and their laughter was soft like a breeze in the trees, and he smiled too, though they could not see him later. That evening, as the sky turned pink and the birds returned to their nests, the woman stood near the barn holding a basket full of fresh carrots, and her arms were scratched and sore, but her face showed peace for the first time since she had arrived. And she looked at the land and at the sky and at her children and then at the farmer, and she said, I was a fighter, once a leader of the broken and the lost, but now I only want to be a mother with soil on my hands and food for my young. The farmer did not ask what kind of war she had fought or what kind of loss she had seen. He only nodded and said, you are safe here. And she nodded too, but there was a flicker in her eyes, a shadow of fear that never left completely. And when the night came again and the house grew quiet, she walked through the halls, checking each window, each door, each corner, like she had done it 1,000 times before. That night she slept sitting up near the door with a small blade in her hand hidden under her sleeve, and her body still tense even as sleep pulled at her. And the farmer saw her there when he came to check the fire, and he did not say anything. He only placed a second blanket over her shoulders and left the room, and outside the wind picked up again, carrying the whispers of something that was not yet done, something that still hunted her through stars and storms and silence. The next morning came with a strange silence in the air, as if the wind itself had paused to listen, and the birds had decided not to sing, and the farmer felt it deep in his bones, like something was not right, something was coming, something close and dangerous. And when he looked out the window, he saw 3 black vehicles parked at the edge of the dirt road, engines off, doors shut, and the dust still rising around them like ghosts crawling out of the earth. He stepped outside with calm steps, though his heart was heavy with worry and his hands clenched at his sides. And the woman stood near the barn, already alert, already still like a shadow, waiting for the first movement, and her children were nowhere in sight, hidden as planned under the old wooden floor inside the cellar, with food and blankets and instructions whispered the night before. When she sensed the danger in her dreams, the doors of the vehicles opened all at once, and 5 men stepped out wearing dark uniforms with silver emblems that marked them as members of the Border Council, the same council that ruled this part of the land and enforced the rules that most people followed out of fear, not respect. And their eyes were cold and their faces unreadable as they walked toward the farmhouse in a line like hunters approaching prey. They thought already cornered. The man in the front was tall and thin, with sharp features and a voice that slid through the air like a blade, and he greeted the farmer without warmth and asked questions without waiting for answers, like, do you know the law? Do you know what happens when someone shelters an undocumented being? Do you understand the risk you have brought to this quiet valley?" And the farmer stood firm and said, "She is alone with children and needs food and shelter and work and nothing more." The councilman narrowed his eyes and said, "Nothing is ever just that. Nothing is ever simple when it comes from the stars," and then turned his gaze to the woman, who had not moved a muscle since they arrived, and he asked her name and she gave none, and he asked her planet and she gave none, and he asked her status and she replied, "I have no status, only hunger and hands that work and children who breathe and dream." The councilman laughed without humor and said, "That is not enough here, not in our land, not in our rules," and he warned the farmer, "This is your only warning. Next time there will be penalties and removal and silence." And the farmer looked at the woman and then at the council and said, "I have lived here all my life and this land has fed me, and I will not let it starve someone else." And the councilman said, "Then be ready to lose it with." That the men turned and walked back to their vehicles, their boots crushing the wet ground and their silence louder than their voices. And as they drove away, the woman finally let out the breath she had been holding since sunrise, and her legs trembled slightly, though she stood her ground, and her eyes watched the road long after the vehicles vanished into the distance, as if expecting them to turn back at any moment. The farmer walked to her and asked if she was all right, and she nodded once, but her voice was tight as she said, "They were not hunters. They were scouts, and if they return, they will not come alone." And he asked her how she knew, and she said, "I have seen such men before. They come with rules and masks and orders, but behind them follow the shadows that wear no badge and leave no survivors later." That day she sharpened her blade with slow, careful strokes, while the children stayed inside, and the farmer worked the field with heavy thoughts circling his mind. And when the sun began to set, he looked up and saw something in the sky, a flash of light too bright to be a star and too fast to be natural, and it vanished behind the hills, leaving only a trail of smoke and a feeling like the world had shifted slightly off balance. He returned to the house and locked the doors and checked the cellar and told the children stories to keep them calm and their eyes wide and silent and full of questions. They did not dare speak, and when they fell asleep, the woman stood at the door again, watching the night with her blade in hand, and her breath slow and steady, like someone who had fought monsters and survived, but still feared the ones that hunted in silence. The wind picked up again, whispering through the trees and carrying the scent of metal and ash, and somewhere far in the darkness the ground rumbled once like a warning from the earth itself, and the woman whispered to herself a name that no one else heard, a name long buried under pain and loss and memory, and she knew that her past had found her again. The sky turned darker than usual that evening, with clouds moving like silent waves across the stars, and the air became thick and strange, like something old had woken from the woods, and the farmer could feel it in his chest, like pressure building slowly. And the woman felt it too, though she said nothing, as she checked every door and window twice and placed small silent alarms made from stones and wire near the barn and the back fence. She told the children to stay underground no matter what they heard, no matter what footsteps came above, and she kissed each one on the forehead and told them a soft story in a language the farmer could not understand, but the sound of it felt like the kind of lullaby made for warriors and dreamers. And then she sealed the trapdoor with care and stood up straight, her blade tied to her arm and her back strong as ever. The farmer wanted to say something, but the look in her eyes held no space for comfort, only focus and readiness and memory of nights like this one, where darkness meant more than just sleep. And when she finally spoke, her voice was cold and quiet, and she said, "Tonight they might come and I will not run again." And the farmer nodded and picked up the old rifle that had not been used in years and checked its barrel with shaking hands. Hours passed slowly with no sound but the wind and the soft rustle of leaves, until something changed. The birds in the forest stopped moving, and a branch snapped far too close, and then another, and then silence again, thicker than before, and the woman moved like a shadow toward the barn, where the animals had gone restless, and the farmer followed close behind, his steps light but unsure, and his heart beating louder than his breath inside the barn. The animals were pacing and snorting, and their eyes wide and afraid, and the woman scanned the corners and edges and rafters until she saw a small blinking light near the roof that did not belong to anything human, and she climbed the ladder with silent speed and reached for it and found a tiny black drone the kind used for tracking heat and sound and signature, and when she crushed it between her hands, it let out a high soft buzz and died in her grip. She whispered, "They are close," and climbed down fast and told the farmer to return to the house and wait near the children and lock the cellar door from the inside, and not open it unless he heard her voice twice, and then once more, and he hesitated but obeyed and ran back through the night wind that now carried a strange metallic smell, and the trees whispered like they were warning the earth below. She stood in the open near the edge of the field, her hair caught in the wind, her eyes fixed on the shadows that danced between the trees, and she waited, not moving, not blinking, and then they came 5 figures dressed in black armor with glowing lines across their arms and necks, and weapons drawn, not guns but long sharp tools that hummed with quiet energy, like they could cut not only skin but memory itself. They moved in a line toward her, and she did not move, and they spoke in a language not meant for kindness or peace, and she answered in the same tongue, her words sharp and fast like knives. And then one of them stepped forward and struck without warning, and she dodged with grace that came from pain and time, and struck back with her blade that moved like lightning and drew no blood but tore the armor like cloth. The fight was silent and brutal and fast, and the earth below them seemed to shake with each move, and the stars above watched without blinking, and the farmer inside the cellar heard nothing but felt everything, and the children clung to him and asked with their eyes if she would win, and he said yes again and again, even though he did not know, and outside the fight grew louder and closer. 2 of them fell not dead but broken, and the others pulled back and called something into their wrists, and then vanished into the woods with speed that left only dust and scent behind, and the woman fell to one knee breathing hard, her blade covered in sparks, not blood, in her arm bleeding from a cut near the shoulder that burned like fire, but she stood again and walked back to the house without a sound. She knocked 3 times in the pattern they had agreed, and the farmer opened the trapdoor and saw her there, tired and strong and bleeding and beautiful in the way storms are beautiful when they pass and leave everything standing, and the children ran to her, and she held them with one arm and looked at the farmer with eyes that said more than any words could ever say. That night no one slept, and no one spoke much, and the fire burned low, and the wind finally calmed, and the woman sat with the children between her arms, and the farmer sat nearby, his rifle across his knees, and outside the world remained quiet, but no one believed it would stay that way for long. The morning sun rose through a smoky sky with light that looked weaker than before, and the birds did not return to the trees, and the farmer stood outside with a heavy heart as he looked over the broken ground near the barn where the grass had been scorched by feet that did not belong to this world, and the woman stood beside him, her arm wrapped in cloth, her eyes scanning the edge of the forest for movement that never came. She had not slept, and neither had he, and the children had stayed hidden, though they cried once during the night, and the farmer had whispered to them stories of heroes and stars and safety that felt far away. And now the silence around the house did not feel peaceful, it felt like something holding its breath, waiting for the next storm to fall from the sky. The woman walked through the fields with slow steps, her feet tracing the paths where vegetables once grew, and she touched the earth like she was remembering something old and sacred, and she said softly, "This land is alive, and it will protect us if we let it." And then she knelt and dug into the soil with her bare hands, pulling out small metal pieces that shimmered in the light, and placing them in a circle that only she could see. The farmer watched her and asked what she was doing, and she said, "I'm setting a trap not for the ones who walk but for the ones who fly and crawl and listen from under the ground." And when he asked how she knew they would return, she looked at him with eyes full of memory and said, "Because they always return, they follow until there is nothing left to take." She spent the whole day digging and shaping the earth and placing strange devices between the rows of carrots and potatoes and under the old water tank near the edge of the hill, and the farmer helped where he could, though most of the things she used made no sense to him, and he wondered how someone who looked like a mother who worked with hands and soil could also build weapons with such skill and precision. That evening she lit a small fire away from the house and sat near it, with her children close and her hands working on a small round object that glowed faint blue and clicked softly with each turn, and she spoke to them in her language again teaching them things he could not understand, and their faces lit with joy for the first time in days, and the farmer sat nearby with a quiet smile. Though his mind remained full of worry, when night came the wind changed again, and brought with it the smell of metal and fuel and ash, and the woman stood up fast and walked to the field, where she had laid her traps, and stood in the middle, with her arms raised and her eyes closed, and the children stayed inside the house, this time not hidden but waiting and ready, and the farmer stood at the window, rifle in hand, watching her every move. Then came the hum, low at first like a whisper under the ground, and then louder like the sound of bees wrapped in fire, and from above came 5 black shapes, fast and sharp like arrows cutting through the sky, and they dropped near the field with dust and sparks, and from them came more soldiers with armor that pulsed red with heat and anger, and their voices shouted in commands not meant for peace. The woman opened her eyes and said one word in a tongue older than stars, and the field came alive with light and sound, and the ground shook as her traps sprang open with force and heat and smoke, and the soldiers stumbled back, confused and screaming, and one of them vanished into flame, and another fell into the earth as it opened beneath his feet like the land itself. Was angry, the farmer ran outside, firing once into the smoke, not to hit but to draw their eyes, and when they turned she appeared from the side, blade in hand, moving like a shadow born from fire and ash, and struck with speed that no machine could match, and her eyes burned with fury, not just for now but for every moment they had taken from her and her people and her family. The fight did not last long because they were not ready. For someone who had already lost everything and had nothing left to fear, and when the last one fell with a scream, swallowed by the soil, the smoke cleared and the light faded, and the woman stood alone, her body cut and bruised but alive, and her eyes searched the field for movement but found only silence and the breath of wind over the grass. The children ran to her then, arms wide and voices crying, and the farmer followed and stood beside them, and together they looked over the field that now bore the marks of war and warning, and the woman whispered, "They will return with more and stronger, but tonight we stand and tomorrow we prepare." And the farmer nodded, not because he understood everything, but because he believed in her. Now the next day began with smoke still rising from the burnt edge of the field, and the smell of scorched earth hanging heavy in the air, while the farmer repaired the broken fence with slow, tired hands, and the woman sat on the porch, sharpening her blade with quiet focus and watching the road that led to the horizon, where danger waited like a shadow too large to see all at once. The children were quieter than usual, sitting near the barn, drawing in the dust with sticks and stones while whispering to each other in soft, broken words as if trying to make sense of what they had seen. And the farmer looked at them and felt something deep in his chest, something like sadness mixed with pride, because they had not cried last night, not even once, and that told him they had already seen more than children ever should. The woman stood up suddenly and walked to the farmer and said, "They will not stop, not now, and not here." And he asked her, "What should we do?" And she said, "We run, but not blindly, and not far, only to where they cannot track us." And he asked, "Where is that?" And she told him of an old mining tunnel hidden behind the northern ridge, a place forgotten by maps and machines, a place where signals could not reach and drones could not fly. She said it was not safe forever, but safe enough to rest and plan and breathe. And the farmer looked at his house and his land and his memories, and he said, "I will come too." And she nodded, because she had already known he would say that, and together they began to prepare what little they could carry and what little the children would need, and what tools might help them survive what was still coming by afternoon. They had packed food and water and blankets, and the woman had placed small traps around the house, not to fight but to delay and warn, and the farmer had hidden his rifle in a long coat and tied ropes and tools to his belt, and the children were given small bags with warm clothes and soft lights, and the oldest was told to lead the others if anything went wrong, and he nodded with the quiet strength of someone who had no choice but to grow fast as the sky darkened with the coming night. The group stood near the edge of the forest, ready to move, and the woman looked back once at the house that had given her shelter and said softly, "Thank you, not to the farmer, but to the walls and the floor and the fire and the wind that had wrapped her children in warmth when she could not." And the farmer placed a hand on her shoulder and said, "We will find another home, but Before they could take the first step, a sound broke the silence, a sound sharp and clear and cruel like metal tearing through the sky, and they turned and saw a shape above the trees, a drone bigger than any they had seen before, its lights blinking like eyes full of cold hate, and its speakers crackling with the voice of the councilman who had come days before. Now louder and colder and full of final warnings, he said, "You were told once you were warned, and now there will be no second chances." And the drone released something from its belly, a small object that fell fast toward the earth, and the woman screamed for the children to run, and the farmer grabbed the bags and the rope and followed her into the trees as the object hit the ground with a flash of white light and a wave of sound that knocked birds from the sky. The forest was dark and full of roots and branches, but the woman moved like wind through stone, guiding the children with sharp eyes and fast feet, while the farmer followed close behind, breathing hard and feeling the ground shake beneath them as more drones arrived above, searching, scanning, hunting, and the woman led them off the path through a narrow passage covered in moss and into a hidden cave behind a wall of vines. Inside, it was cold and damp, and the air smelled of stone and silence, and the children huddled near the back while the woman placed her hand on the wall and pressed a small stone that clicked and revealed a hidden tunnel sloping downward into darkness, and she said, "This will take us far, but we must move fast and quiet and not stop until we reach the deep." They lit their lights and entered the tunnel one by one, the walls pressing close, the air getting colder, the sound of footsteps echoing like ghosts of those who had walked here before, and the woman led the way, her blade drawn, her eyes sharp, and the farmer stayed behind, watching the rear, ready to fight if something followed. Hours passed without change until the tunnel opened into a wide chamber where old machines stood covered in dust and silence, and the woman said, "We sleep here and move again at dawn," and the children lay down on the stone floor without complaint, while the farmer sat against the wall and tried to forget the sound of drones in the trees. And somewhere above them in the forest where the house once stood, the drone hovered over the ruins, sending signals back to its masters and waiting for the next command. The tunnel walls trembled softly as distant echoes rolled through the stone like forgotten voices trying to find their way home, and the woman woke before anyone else, her ears sharp and her breath slow as she listened to the earth speak, and the children still slept wrapped in old blankets and soft shadows, while the farmer stirred from his spot near the cold machine, his fingers wrapped around the old rifle, like it was the only thing left from his past that still mattered. She walked through the chamber with steps that made no sound, her blade still tied to her side, her eyes watching the dark edges for movement that never came, and yet she could feel something shifting far above, as if the stars themselves were moving in ways they should not. And when she placed her hand against the stone, she whispered a name, not hers, not the farmer's, but one lost long ago, and the stone warmed beneath her palm as if it remembered her voice. The farmer opened his eyes and saw her standing like a statue of light and shadow, and he asked her what she had seen, and she said, "They are still searching, and they will not stop, not until they find us, or until we make a place they cannot enter." And he asked her what kind of place could that be, and she looked around the ancient chamber and said, "One built not on fear but on fire and truth and courage." Did not fully understand, but he stood beside her and nodded because he trusted her more than any voice he had ever known. And soon the children woke and ate the last of the food they had brought, and the woman opened a smaller passage within the chamber, a path hidden behind broken metal that led deeper into the mountain, and they followed her without question, because now she was not only their protector, she was their light. As they moved through the narrow path, the walls became smoother, the air warmer, the silence deeper, and when they reached the end, they stood before a vast hollow space where light from the cracks above painted gold across the stone, and water trickled down the walls into a clear pool at the center. And the woman stepped forward and said, "Here is where we begin again." And no one argued, because somehow it already felt true. They built slowly, using tools from the old machines, and stone from the walls, and wood from the tunnel entrances, and each night they took turns watching the path behind, while the others slept. And each morning the woman trained the children in ways to listen, ways to hide, and ways to stand when running was no longer an option. And the farmer taught them to plant and grow and mend and shape the earth into a home time past in a way that could not be counted by days or months only by the things they built and the stories they told, and the way the children began to laugh again, not just in whispers but in full sound and joy that echoed off the walls like sunlight on water, and the woman smiled. More than she had before, though never for long, because the world above was still there, and it was not yet safe one night, when the stars aligned above the cracks and filled the chamber with silver light. The woman called them all together and said, "We are not the only ones who have suffered, and we will not be the last. And we cannot wait for kindness from those who rule by fear and silence, and if we do nothing, then we are nothing, and if we hide forever, then we are already gone." The farmer looked at her and asked, "What do we do?" And she said, "We send a message not of war but of welcome, a signal to others who have run, who have lost, who have wandered through worlds without shelter and hope. And we tell them there is a place now hidden in the bones of the mountain where they can begin again. They worked for weeks building a signal from parts taken from the broken machines and wires found in the deepest tunnels, and the day it was ready, the woman stood before the console, her hand shaking for the first time, and she said, "This is not a call to fight, but a call to live." And she pressed the switch, and the chamber filled with soft sound like music from a world not yet born, far across the stars and places where refugees waited in silence and darkness. A signal blinked on their screens, and a voice whispered through the static, "Come home." And they listened, and they believed, and they began to move, and the path to the mountain was lit by stories and footsteps and dreams, carried by those who had lost everything but hope. The woman stood at the entrance of the chamber, watching the lights grow brighter in the distance, and the farmer stood beside her, the children close, and she said, "We are not just survivors, we are the beginning." And when the first traveler arrived covered in dust and silence, she opened her arms and said, "Welcome to the place we made with broken hands and unbroken hearts."